Okay, welcome World History to the first lesson on our Ancient Egypt unit. Alright, so what do you know about Ancient Egypt? Well, you probably know stuff about mummies and, you know, crazy giant pyramids in the desert. Or maybe you heard about one of the longest rivers in the world. Well, there you go. That's the Sphinx, okay? Or maybe this. Or maybe that. Or perhaps this. All these magnificent structures that have left behind an enduring legacy that people have been fascinated with for years. Now, we talked about Sumer, and Egypt is a very different civilization, right? Their cultural and ethnic racial diversity are shown throughout its 3,000 year history, okay? And the most important geographic feature for ancient Egypt is the Nile River, okay? So here we have the Nile River. We have the two Upper and Lower Egypt, with the major cities and the major buildings built there. We have the Great Pyramids in Giza. We have the Great Sphinx at Giza. Okay. We have the Valley of the Kings down here where many pharaohs have been buried. Alright, so the beginning of ancient Egypt dates back to around 6000 BC. It's when the first inhabitants began to settle. And by 3100 BC, what it was originally two different kingdoms reunited both Upper and Lower Egypt. Okay? And the Upper Egypt was named, the king of the Upper Egypt named Narmer had united the two together. Narmer moves the capital to Memphis, which is right here. Whoops. Oh, there was another map. There it is, Memphis. Now, one of the things that makes Egypt unique is how their pharaohs ruled. The pharaohs themselves ended up ruling as gods, which is very different from Mesopotamia, where kings were representatives of the gods, not actually gods themselves. Pharaohs were the center of Egypt's religion, government, and army. Now, so would Egyptians ever question a pharaoh's decision? Of course not, because they are God. Hieroglyphics. Okay, this is the Egyptian writing. Okay, it's based on characters, pictorial characters for words and sound. And here is the alphabet below. Rosetta Stone. Okay, this is carries an inscription that has different languages. This is the key that helped us decipher the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, and it's the only surviving fragment from a much larger stone slab recording a decree on 27th of March 196 BC. Alright, social classes in ancient Egypt. High priest and nobles. We had the pharaoh at the top, followed by high priest and nobles, officials, scribes, and minor priests, followed by craftsmen, servants, laborers, and peasants, and then finally, then eventually they would add slaves as well during the New Kingdom. Okay, so it's very different compared to this, to Mesopotamia and how things were done there. Members of Narmer's family will pass the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt from father to son to grandson. You'll notice here's the crown of Upper Egypt, here's the crown of Lower Egypt, and then they united them. So a series of rulers form a single family is called a dynasty. And ancient Egypt would consist of 31 different dynasties spanning 2,800 years. Okay? Egyptians believed that their pharaoh ruled even after his death. He had what was called an eternal spirit, a Ka, that continued to take part in the governing of Egypt. Okay? Egyptians also believed that the Ka remained much like a living pharaoh in its needs and pleasures. And the pharaoh's tomb would need the following: eternal comforts. So the artist would decorate the walls of the burial chamber with pictures of whatever he might need or like: endless meals, loved ones, devoted servants, etc. Luxuries, fine jewelry, game boards with precious stones, rich clothing, and inscriptions. Writings of what the pharaoh achieved in life were also found on the tomb walls. Alright, so we have Egypt's history is divided into three different kingdoms. Even though they're 31 dynasty, we split those dynasties up into three different periods: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. So the Old Kingdom was the age of pyramid building. Okay, the pharaohs expected to reign forever, and the idea was that their tombs, the pyramids, were more important than their palaces. And so these were blocks from the pyramids, typically weighed at least 2.5 tons. Some would weigh up to 15 tons. The peasants worked on the pyramids in order to be fed during the flood season, and about 80 pyramids still stand in the Egyptian desert. And then, of course, the most famous pyramids are the pyramids of Giza, which is one of the seven ancient wonders of the world, as well as one of the current seven wonders of the world. Many of the ancient wonders of the world are no longer with us. And then, as you can see, you can actually see the Great Sphinx below. Okay, this gives you an idea of how they built the pyramid. All right. One of the things that's interesting is they built multiple passageways to help protect robbers from stealing the items inside the pharaoh's tomb. Eventually, people figured out the code over time, but you'll notice that even the queen has her own room here. Um, so, like, you had one passage that went to the pit that was a trap, and that was the idea here was to lure people down. And then they realized there was an enclosed passageway here that if it was removed, it would lead. And then there were multiple traps here, leading to different ways, and so forth. Alright, first illness brings ruin. So the Old Kingdom will eventually come to an end. The power of the pharaohs does decline, and more power fell to the nobles and officials. Local rulers will struggle among themselves for power, and the civil war is going to tear Egypt apart. And so royal power will eventually return at the start of the Middle Kingdom in 2080 BC. Law and order does return, and we see some strong kings. Farming is revived, trade grows, and the arts are going to flourish. The capital is going to move from Memphis to Thebes, where two massive temples were built there, and public projects are created by the great trade brought in. Afterlife for commoners. So during the Old Kingdom, only the pharaohs had expected to live forever. During the Middle Kingdom, Egyptians came to believe that ordinary people had eternal souls as well. And then, unfortunately, a second illness brings ruin again, and then, of course, civil war also breaks out. Egypt this time becomes prey to outside invaders. Egyptians were ruled by several groups, one called the Hyksos, which were Asian nomads. They ruled from 1640 to 1570 BC, and Egyptians despised the less civilized Hyksos. But the Hyksos do bring new skills to the Egyptians: the ability to make bronze for tools and weapons. The Egyptians had been using copper, and the ability to wage war from horse-drawn chariots. Shooting arrows from a powerful new kind of bow, and spinning and weaving techniques. Alright, and then finally we get to the New Kingdom, the largest and probably the most grand after the Old Kingdom. Alright, this kingdom was much more powerful. It was wealthier than it ever was before. This is the time period where King Tutankhamun ruled. Egyptians will become conquerors, and we'll see for the first time a professional army will assemble, which will include bowmen, charioteers, and infantry. And this is some of the most famous pharaohs of all time are from the New Kingdom period. We're going to talk about a few. Okay, so here is King Tutankhamun's tomb. He died at the age of 16. He was 8 years old when he became pharaoh. And there's the tomb. So that was found November 4th, 2007. King Tut's mummy unmasked and on public display in Egypt for the first time since being discovered 85 years ago. A facial reconstruction model of King Tutankhamun made by a French team based on CT scans of the Boy King's mummy. That is one of the two mummified fetuses found in the tomb of King Tutankhamun in 1922 during modern preparations for a DNA test in Cairo, Egypt. Alright. During this time, we'll actually see rule by a queen. Queen Hatshepsut declares herself pharaoh around 1478 BC because her stepson was too young to rule, and she ends up ruling for 22 years. Hatshepsut was better known for encouraging trade than waging war, like previous pharaohs at this time. Queen Hatshepsut, archaeologists today have found that a missing tooth used a missing tooth to positively identify the mummy of Hatshepsut, Egypt's greatest woman pharaoh who reigned more than 3,000 years ago. Alright, the temple at Deir el-Bahri. Hatshepsut is an 18th dynasty pharaoh who was one of a handful of female rulers in Egypt, kind of like Cleopatra. Her reign was the longest of all the female pharaohs, and her funerary temple still stands as a tribute to her incredible rise to power. Alright. There it is, Temple of Deir al-Bahri. Alright. She carved scenes on her great funeral temple to show her officials on a trade expedition to the East African coast, buying myrrh, frankincense, ebony, ivory, and leopard skins. No one knows whether Hatshepsut died naturally or was murdered by her stepson, Thutmose III, which a lot of people believe that that's what actually happened, that her stepson eventually murdered her and he took the throne. Alright, Thutmose III is going to be a more warlike pharaoh than than his stepmother. He ruled from 1450 to 1425. He conducted 15 victorious invasions into Palestine and Syria, and his armies also pushed south as far as Nubia and returned with thousands of slaves. Alright, images of Thutmose III. So, gives you an idea of what he looked like. Alright, by 1300 BC, Egyptians come face to face with the Hittites. Their armies will meet at Kadesh in 1288 BC, and they will fight each other to a standstill. The pharaoh and the Hittite king will make a treaty to promise peace and brotherhood between us forever. For the rest of the century, the two kingdoms were allies. The Old Kingdom will builders built pyramids for their pharaohs' tombs. The pyramids were too visible and easily robbed, and so rulers of the New Kingdom built their tombs beneath desert cliffs. The site they chose was the remote Valley of the Kings near Thebes. That's where they found King Tutankhamun. Alright, so one of the reasons why they found Tutankhamun's tomb is that there was an old tomb that had been buried. It was buried underneath by another tomb. Alright, Ramses II. Alright, he's probably the most famous ruler of all the New Kingdom pharaohs. Alright, he reigned for 67 years from 1279 to 1212 BC. He lived to the age of 99 and was the father of 150 children. Ramses created the giant temple of Amun, the Egyptians' chief god at Karnak. And the buildings were huge and impressive, but they are not as skillfully built as those of the Old Kingdom, as you can see here. He may be the most famous of all the Egyptian kings, lived well into his 80s. By the time of his death, he had severe arthritis, arteriosclerosis, and abscesses in his teeth. Temple of Amun at Karnak. Egypt's power declined in 1200 BC. Invasions destroyed many kingdoms. Egyptian records speak of attacks by the people of the sea. Little is known of these invaders, but their destruction was very vast. Both the Egyptian and Hittite kingdoms fell to these mysterious enemies. And in 671 BC, Assyrians took over Egypt. A century and a half later, it was the Persians' turn to conquer Egypt. Alright, and thank you for the show.